My first real job in the British film industry was a third assistant director on The Saint. And so I was at Associated British Pictures, ABP Studios in Elstree. There were two first ADs. One was Pat Kelly, who was this tough old Irishman, and the other was Frank Holland, who went on to Gerry Anderson. And I was this little kid who arrived at the studios, and Frank Holland and Pat Kelly looked at me and looked at this kid. And I remember Pat Kelly saying to me, "I never want to see you. But when I take one step backwards, I want to tread on you." Best training I've ever had for being in the television business. Because in other words, be there, watch everything, really get a sense of what's going on and be useful. So I was a third AD on The Saint. I went on to Gideon's Way and a lot of those other TV shows of the 60s, the mid-60s. And then became a second assistant under Frank Holland. And Frank was then hired away to be production manager for Gerry Anderson, right at the end of Thunderbirds, and to really sort of set up Captain Scarlet as a more professional operation. And Frank called me up one day and he said, "How would you like to come over and work on puppets?" And I sort of said, "Okay." I used to watch it from Stingray on. In fact, I remember, I can still sing you the Marina, Aqua Marina. I used to watch it regularly, and then Thunderbirds came on and everybody watched Thunderbirds. I mean, it really was, up until the time of something like The Prisoner, it was probably the most must viewing around. And it was fantastic, so the chance of going to work for Gerry was really cool. And I went and I met Gerry and I met Sylvia in the Slough slum, the dreadful trading estate studios. We used to joke at the time about the John Betjeman poem, "Come friendly bombs and fall on Slough." It really was an awful place. But I met Gerry and I met Sylvia and they said, "Look, come along, be the first AD on Captain Scarlet. And if we like you and if things work out, we'll give you a chance at directing." So I moved on over to Slough. It was still pre-production for Scarlet, because I remember sitting on one of the stages watching as they were building that amazing Mysteron base and sort of looking at it and thinking, this is really cool, and particularly when it blew up. I suppose basically the concept is the man that fate made indestructible. He was a man who was basically destroyed and then was cloned by the Mysterons. And the clone happened to be indestructible. Presumably one could sort of say that the molecules that made up his body, even if dispelled in about 2 million different things, would come back together. What of course is interesting about Captain Scarlet is this clone, for want of a better word, retained his original memories and his original personality, whereas everybody else who was taken over became a Mysteron agent. What was never explained, and I don't think anybody ever thought about it, because you didn't sort of work out those things in those days, is how did Captain Scarlet remain Captain Scarlet when Captain Black became a Mysteron agent and everybody else who was taken over by the Mysterons just became a sort of automaton and were perfectly happy to blow themselves up. It's a fabulous modern concept. And I was used to a normal television set, shooting, and that meant everybody had to be quiet, and, the first AD ran the floor, and you basically said, "Quiet everybody," and you moved everybody around. Well, they'd never had ADs up till that point. They'd had assistants to the director, but they were just assistants. And I remember one time coming on the floor quite early on and sort of saying, "Right, quiet, please!" And one of the lip sync operators saying, "Why? There's no audio here. It's all pre-recorded. It all comes down these wires." So that was how I began my time with Gerry Anderson. We were starting Captain Scarlet. And Gerry also had me directing some Thunderbirds commercials. I remember we used to do Lions Made Ice Lollies and a whole lot of other things like that. So I started directing. I kind of cut my directing teeth on those commercials. And then, about little ways into Captain Scarlet, I was asked if I'd kind of written an outline for a script, and I was asked if I wanted to write it. And so I wrote it, Place of the Angels. And then I was asked if I wanted to direct it, which was really, really cool. So my very first professional script that was produced, I directed. It was actually a short story I'd been working on before I joined Captain Scarlet, the idea of poisoning a city through putting a toxin in the reservoir. But I had always wanted, I'd had this image, I think I'd seen it in some Hammer horror film before, of one of those labs with the mechanical hands and somebody using the mechanical hands to strangle somebody. And I remember going to Keith Wilson and saying, can we do this? And he would say, whoa, I don't know, that's a lot of complicated maneuvering. But I really wanted that scene where the Mysterons basically use the mechanical hands to strangle the scientist. So I sort of said, oh, come on, please, 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 can we do it? You know, pretty please. And they found a way to do it. And I vividly remember shooting that scene and thinking, this is fun. I have imagined, I mean, for somebody who wanted to be a writer, wanted to be a director, here I'd imagined a scene in my head, and I'm now shooting it in a huge 35mm camera and making it work. And that was when I really felt, you know, this is fun. I like this. Maybe I'll do this for a living. The layout of the Slough studios, you had the special effects stages, and then you kind of went across to another building and you had the two puppet stages. And then you went across to another building and you had the big stage, which is where they were shooting Thunderbirds 6. And then I think you went across to a fourth building, if I remember right, which is where there were cutting rooms and other sort of elements. You'd walk in and the two puppet stages were sort of side by side with a connecting door. And then the sort of wardrobe puppet department was at one end, so you could go into it from either stage. And then at that far end, there were big double doors that opened up to the outside. The puppet stages on the whole would be built on the right. To the left was a little booth, about 4 steps going up where the lip sync operator sat. Every time I read something about the great puppet days, it's like, oh, there were these wonderful, wonderful ways where the dialogue was pre-recorded and it was fed down the wires into the solenoids in the heads of the puppets, and they just did their things automatically. That is such a laugh, because 9 times out of 10, they never worked. And if they worked at all, they kind of worked half-heartedly. So even through to Secret Service, so all the way through Captain Scarlet, Joe 90 and the rest, the lip sync operator was still waggling the toggle switch to open and close the mouth in time with the dialogue the way it had always been. As the director, you'd be popping up and down constantly, but you'd basically be directing from the floor. And then you would sometimes go up to the booth just to see what the actual shot looked like, because there was video assist on the cameras, so you could actually see what the camera was seeing. It was probably the lowest quality. I think it was literally in the Mitchell camera, there's a point where you have a ground glass screen that goes into the actual viewfinder. And I think they'd set up something that just had a camera on that ground glass screen. And then it was fed directly to an old television set. So you had this really sort of slightly grainy black and white image. But it was what the camera was seeing. Up until that time, you really were taking the cameraman's view that, oh, the shot's great. This, at least, you could see what the cameraman was seeing. And that, for a director, was actually kind of, you know, very, very helpful. You could see the performance. You could see that the puppet jerked in a way that you didn't want it to, and that you might not have noticed if you'd just been standing on the floor. So I remember sort of, you know, you'd set everything up on the floor. You know, you'd pop up to the director's booth. You'd tell Ian or whoever it was who was a lip sync operator, is everything working? Let's check. You'd go down. You'd probably see a run through on the floor. But then when you were actually shooting, you'd probably go up to the director's booth just to actually see, you know, how it looked on the screen. And then you'd come down again. But you were constantly moving backwards and forwards. The sets were all built on stages which were about, I guess, 18 inches off the ground, probably, if I remember right. And would be everything was third scale, so some of the sets were very big indeed. Above the stage you had the puppeteer rails, sort of metal steps going up to them, and then the rails where the puppets were being operated from. And there was a sense of sort of constant activity and puppeteers coming down and puffing the strings, because we used to have to puff the strings with those powdered pigments to kind of make them blend away into the background. You know, the puppeteers bitching up on the rail, Julian adjusting his lighting. A lot of lights, because we were shooting 35mm and it was very hot on the stages. So you'd also have big fans that would be turned on in various points just to cool everything down. One of the hysterical things was if you had a storm, it was just galvanized iron sheeting, and it was just literally, it was a warehouse. When it rained, it sounded like thunder on that roof. And there were times literally when you couldn't hear what the puppeteers were saying and you couldn't hear the dialogue and speak up, because we just shoot through that because it wasn't audio. The camera, and it was a big Mitchell camera, one of those big hulking great things, was almost always on an Elemac dolly, which was one of those dollies so you could move up and down. It was kind of compressed air operated, so one was moving it around. Julian Lugren, who was one of the leading DPs, lighting cameraman, this really gentle presence, kind of moving around on his crutches because he'd had polio. Organizing things, sometimes Keith Wilson, the art director on Captain Scarlet, coming in and bitching that we weren't using his set properly, or he'd built 3 sides and we were only shooting 2, and what did we think we were doing? But it really was, it was a fun, and everybody was young. I mean, the puppeteers were young, the directors were young, the lip sync operators were young. It was an exciting place to work for me. And I can see that the old guard, who had sort of been doing this in a much more family making it. By the time I joined, it was an industry. I think one of the reasons the old timers may have been a little more sort of down on what happened later is Gerry really was trying to professionalize the operation. It's why he brought me in. It's why he brought Frank Hollins in. It's why he brought a lot of people in who'd come from the quote, real television industry. So for us, it was we didn't see this as a step down at all. We saw this as a chance to really kind of take it to bigger and greater heights. And we were all young enough and foolish enough to think that, we were geniuses and it was all going to be magic. Part of the old world were moving up to management, and this was cool too, because we felt this is something, they had the experience, they would help us, they would show us what to do. Derek Meddings was still doing all of his amazing special effects. Gerry and Sylvia were really voices heard off. I mean, they were the Mount Olympus, they weren't involved in the day-to-day operation. And I would guess that's also one of the reasons the old timers, the old guard, felt things had changed, because they used to have that very close relationship with the core team. Well, by the time I joined, that no longer existed, so it wasn't something we missed. It's funny, isn't it, when you look back on something, one can see definite demarcation points. At the time, you don't. You saw the old guard moving on, but you didn't see the overall operation somehow diminishing. For us, it was amazing. I mean, it was really fun. It was a playhouse. And it really was for a lot of the time. I mean, for me, I was young enough when I think back, until I got fired by Gerry some years later. To me, looking back, it was just this wonderful playhouse in a fairly dull, dour set of industrial buildings on a Slough trading estate. When we were making Captain Scarlet, everybody was expecting it to be even more successful than Thunderbirds. It was hindsight that, that Thunderbirds was the sort of the absolute zenith of it, and that it was kind of downhill from there, and Captain Scarlet wasn't quite as good, and Joe 90, and then the Secret Service, which I still think is fun, but was really something of a disaster. I actually remember everybody was quite excited about the fact that the puppets were much more human scale. Everyone except the puppeteers, who hated them. They absolutely hated the smaller heads and the fact that nothing was controllable, and the heads would suddenly go bloop, bloop, bloop. To us, a lot of the people who would talk about, Four Feather Falls and all of that sort of stuff, well, okay, that was past. We're in now. This is the new show. This is the show that's really going to, up the ante, make the puppets even better, make it more natural, make it more realistic. And that to us was fun. We all socialized, so we'd quite often wander across. The special effects stage was just one building over. One would often go, particularly when they were shooting particular shots for one's own show, and you'd storyboarded those ahead of time. You'd sat down with the special effects people and storyboarded it. And you'd often wander in and just see how they were going and see what they were doing. I mean, when they were shooting the takeoff sequence for Doppelganger, Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, and they had this huge rocket constructed between two of the stages, just in this area, two of the buildings, we'd all walk over and look at that. Quite often they were shooting the special effects on your show before you went on the floor yourself. So while you were prepping your show, and I remember going and seeing what they were doing, and it kind of giving me a sense of, oh, because they're shooting it that way in special effects, I'll change the way I'm thinking of plotting my shooting on the stage. And of course, again, in hindsight, it's the special effects that made Century 21 and Supermarionation so cool. I mean, we thought the special effects were just to support us, the main directors, and it was our wonderful puppet shooting that made these things successful. Joe 90 is my favourite show, much more actually than Captain Scarlet. I mean, it's a horrifying concept by today's standards. You know, it's like you take this little 9-year-old kid and you put all of these brain waves of other people into his head, and he then goes off and kills people or shoots people or becomes a secret agent or risks his life every day. I mean, you know, Professor McClade would be arrested and jailed by today's standards for what he puts that kid through. What I loved about Joe 90, it is the ultimate kid's fantasy. You know, what kid doesn't want to be a jet pilot? What kid doesn't want to be a secret agent? What kid doesn't want to be king for a day? And so, to me, it is this wonderful sense of a child being able to one-up adults, which is a dream that every child has when you're being controlled by your parents or you're controlled by your teachers. So Joe is this wonderful vehicle for going places that no kid can ever go. It was also, in my mind, one of the most inventive technologically. The Big Rat, the brain impulse galvanometer, whatever it was an amazing piece of hardware. I mean, when you see at the beginning of the titles that fantastic, all the tapes whirring and the lights flickering and Joe going into the cage and it all going crazy. I mean, it is cool. It is really cool. And we had this scene where Joe is camping out alongside the river. It was an episode of Joe 90 called The Fortress. And the idea was that a poisonous snake would come creeping up. So we had the riverbank set, and we had a hovercraft set, a puppet-sized hovercraft. And we'd set it so that the hovercraft could be wheeled down past the back of the stages. And then in the foreground on the stages was all the jungle set. So we could actually track with the hovercraft with the jungle going in foreground. And then Joe gets out and he lights a campfire. And the idea is that there's this poisonous snake that kind of creeps close and he kills it in the knack of time before he's bitten. But we wanted a real snake. And so a snake handler was brought in with a rattlesnake, which the fangs had been milked, and obviously everyone was being very careful with it, and the rattlesnake was on the set and it was weaving through the jungle. And of course it got freaked out by the lights and the noise and everything else, and like any self-respecting snake, it just shot under the stage. You've now got a loose rattlesnake somewhere under the puppet stages, and the whole place is going crazy because yes, it's supposedly not poisonous, yes, the fangs have been milked, but, and there's puppeteers climbing up the rails, oh, what's going on? And I remember Francis, Ian, the lip sync operator, had kind of gone up into the sound in the lip sync booth and closed the door, and the handler was kind of looking around trying to find it. It was great fun. I mean, it was found and it was made safe and it was taken away happily. My other great Joe 90 moment, and I think this is probably my favourite show in that whole series, was King for a Day. Part of that is I'd persuaded Keith to really spend more than he usually spent on the throne room scene and the throne room set. And it was magnificent. I mean, it was this massive, massive, beautiful palace set, and we had sort of ways that Joe could sort of slowly walk down, but we had him on a kind of movable wheel, so it was like the slow move down to meet the Grand Vizier at the end. And it was such fun. It was, it was classic sort of 50s or wartime, Peter Lorre type, my highness, we will get you this time. And it just was fun. And the sets were gorgeous, and it was taking place in a part of the world that I personally loved. So I have very, very fond, and there was more humour. I think that's one of the things. Captain Scarlet was totally humourless. didn't have a scrap of humour in it. Joe 90 had much more humour in it. There was actually, I think it was See You Down There, was one of the episodes where they're basically playing practical jokes on this financier. It's crazy. Not quite as bad as the Secret Service episode where Stanley Unwin actually flies his Model T. And there's this great line which I still remember when, you know, the Gatava or the whatever it is, jets have all destroyed themselves and blown up in the air, and the skipper, you know, the kind of commander of the squadron, covered in smoke and black, he said, "But what chance did we have? It was a Model T." So that See You Down There and that one are sort of the ultimate, in my mind, how weird you could go and still have fun with these shows. The Secret Service, basically, in its simplest form, a priest who had a miniaturizer who could miniaturize his gardener, put his gardener into a little briefcase that he carried around with him, and between them they could solve crimes and do all sorts of wonderful things. And because he was a priest, of course, he had to work with a secret organization called the Bishop, or Bishop, which was some sort of spy entity. And all of us at the time, even at the beginning, said, "What? What is this?" And, you know, Stanley Unwin, who was always a kind of acquired taste, you know, his sort of Unwinese, I never thought it was funny. I mean, I know it was very popular at the time. And then we would have this perfect, it was one of the most beautifully sculpted heads ever made for the puppet series of Stanley Unwin. And this puppet head spouting this amazing gibberish. And it's like, oh? I remember with Errand of Mercy, the one where the Model T is flying, and it's all Stanley Unwin's dream. We were trying to have scenes where explosions were going off with the live puppet in the thing, and we had a big Model T that was swinging and hung. And we were setting, and we had Derek Meddings and his special effects people, well, not Derek, because he was bigger and better things at that point, but we had his special effects people hanging these little packets of explosive against a blue screen. Or against, I guess it was just a psych. And then we'd sort of try and bring the Model T through, and then we'd try and blast the explosion off. And it was total chaos, and it never worked. And we had these explosions going off all over the set. And but it was great fun. The vicarage setting, the set, was beautiful. It was a lovely little cottage set. I think it was a revamped Joe 90's cottage set. And then there was much more, of course, use made of live action, and the Model T was fun. It never worked. They always had trouble on location getting it started and going around. It was the strangest series. It really was. It was so weird. It should have been successful. I'm sure if it had been more widely shown and not sort of buried, it would probably be one of those cult hits that people say, "Did you see the Secret Service?" It was just weird. And by the time it was over, I knew I was going on to UFO anyway. So it was really just marking time until UFO started. Gerry always wanted, even when we did Secret Service, it was very clear he was sick of puppets and just was doing that as a way to kind of keep money coming in until he could get UFO going. By the time that news came down, those who were going on to UFO had already been told. And I think the angst and disappointment and concern of those who heard they were basically going to be out of a job, for me and for the others going on to UFO, first of all, we weren't nearly so attached. I mean, I'd only been there for, 2.5, 3 years. So it was a great gig, and I was going back, I was going back to what I loved, which is live action, because I'd come from it. I'd come from the ABPC studios. I was now going back to MGM, which was a step up. I'd been promised the chance to direct a live action series. I was thinking at the time I would write scripts for it as well, just like I'd done in Captain Scarlet. Never had time on Joe 90 and Secret Service. So to me, it was like, well, that's sad, but I'm going back to what I really love. And we're going to something really, really neat and really, really cool. And this was going to be, because the whole talk at UFO was, this was going to be Britain's answer to Star Trek. And so we were thinking, wow, here we are. I'm 24 years old, 23, 24 years old. I'm going to be a major part of a massive new science fiction series on British television. So there was to me, no, it's like, oh, well, the puppets were fun, but no sense of, oh my goodness, the end of an era. It was, wow, this is the beginning of a whole new era. I think in hindsight, it must have been totally devastating, particularly for people like Christine Granville, who'd been there for so many years. And I think it wasn't done kindly. That I do remember. It wasn't done kindly. It was done as a business decision with very little understanding and thinking for the people who had really made Gerry and Sylvia what they were. I mean, actually, during the puppet years, I had more to do with Reg Hill than I ever did with Gerry Anderson, because he was busy wheeling and dealing and doing all of his stuff. When we started UFO, then, of course, I had a great deal to do with him, because I was his first assistant director on the pilot of UFO. And we got on okay to begin with. He was demanding. He didn't like actors. I remember, I think we'd been shooting for about 3 or 4 days on the pilot of UFO, and he said to me, it was so much simpler when you could just hang up the puppets at the end of the day. These actors you have to deal with and talk to and get involved with. But we got very crosswise on UFO. I mean, number of reasons. First of all, there was a very small bit part that one of the doctors who examines the UFO body, and they lost their actor, and Gerry asked me if I knew somebody who could take his place. And there was a young actor at the Bristol Old Vic who was a great friend of mine, and I suggested him. And he was probably too young for the part, and Gerry had to revoice him. And Gerry kind of always blamed me for that and figured I'd made a mistake doing that. And he grumbled about it for a long time. And he'd also promised me that I would direct UFO, just as I directed Scarlet. He said, be my AD on the pilot, work as an AD for a bit, and then we'll gradually sort of slot you in. But as we got a bit crosswise, and it was looking more and more likely that I wouldn't be directing, and it was a time when I think there must have been a huge amount of pressure. I was also having a mad, passionate affair with one of the guest stars on UFO, and spending far more time being much more interested in her than I was in actually doing my job. And the final sort of, I would say the final doom, as far as I was concerned, was, I can't remember the name of the episode now, but Quinn O'Hara, the guest star, who I was living with at that time, Ken Turner was directing and I was the AD. And it was a pretty bad script. And I remember all of us sitting in Ken's flat one night and going over the script and saying, Quinn and Ken and myself, and saying, we can make this better. And so we basically rewrote it. And I always sort of talk about, if it had been better, we'd have got away with it. It was actually worse, and everybody freaked out, and I became very much, and rightly so, the fall guy. Afterwards, I heard him saying around the studios, well, of course, Leo wasn't really very good anyway, and his puppet shows weren't particularly good. And that pissed me off, because, as history has shown, mine stand up just as well as anybody else's. And I remember thinking at the time, that's unfair. And so Ken sort of survived, I was fired, Quinn and I broke up, and I hopped on a cargo freighter and went to Mexico, thinking I'll never work again in this industry. And basically, created a whole new life, which has been this side of the Atlantic ever since. So I'm deeply, deeply thankful for Gerry for firing me, because I wouldn't be what I do today if I'd stayed in the UK and stayed making films there. All these years later, I think it is such a hoot that something which just one almost fell into, and one was young enough to think this is just cool and nice, is this amazing cult series. There are 3 things that I've done in my past that I'm probably most famous for, and none of them have anything to do with the whole bulk of my career and the hundreds of films I've made over the year. The first is I made films for Gerry Anderson. The second is when I was teaching writing and filmmaking at the University of Texas in Austin back in the 70s, I guess it was. A bunch of my students went out and made a low-budget horror film called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the third was I was working for very low-rent magazines in Los Angeles, also in the early 70s, and shared an office with a certain gentleman who has since become very well known, Ed Wood Jr., who you may be familiar with, known as the worst filmmaker of all time. But 4 or 5 years ago, I got this phone call out of the blue, and this sort of slightly timid voice said, "Is this Leo Eaton?" And I said, yeah. And the voice went on, "Is this the Leo Eaton?" And I sort of thought, well, I'm a Leo Eaton, I'm not sure. You know, I've made a lot of films. But it's the Leo Eaton who did Captain Scarlet. And this guy had tracked me down. And it's like, this was just, none of us thought this was going to be a cult series. You know, so it's hysterical sort of sitting here now and seeing people still talking about it, people still writing about it, the DVDs still available. I love being known for Captain Scarlet and Joe 90 and Secret Service and UFO. And yes, it's something I'm very proud of.